Hello, this is Bintell Powell, and on behalf of Bandit Publishing and our entire team, I want to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in again. To get right to it, a wise salesman, and I'm a salesman, once said to me that it's important that you tell people why you're doing what you're doing, and if your why or the reason why you're doing whatever you're trying to do, whether it be sell a product or change the world somehow, is pure, and if they understand your story, it will lend credence to your product, you, and your mission and everything else. So this episode is dedicated to the why. Why is Bintell Powell so annoying, and why is he doing this? Why is he ranting about color and race and social economic status? Who does he think he is? What gives him the right? For any of you who have watched and listened to any of my previous videos, you'll know and you understand that my why has a lot to do with my mother. 90% of it is my mother and my grandmother, and but it also has to do with other people who I came in contact with because of my mother. People like this gentleman, this kind-faced gentleman named Moneta Sleet, a very, very important figure for all of us throughout this country, specifically for black people in America. This gentleman's name is Moneta Sleet. Excuse me. And I was introduced to him through his wife, Mrs. Sleet. I was introduced to Mrs. Sleet in high school, where I attended Uniondale High School in New York, in Long Island, New York. Mrs. Sleet was in my mind at that time when I first met her, a vicious woman. She was, I don't know if I said she was light-skinned woman with, big curly hair, and she would walk down the halls, and if she saw you out of your class, she would bark at you. I saw her lift up her foot one day and kick a boy in the ass for not being in class. Literally, she kicked him. She had on heels, she had on stiletto heel shoes, and she lifted up her foot, and this guy was no punk. She lifted up her foot and kicked him in the ass like she was kicking a soccer ball into a goal. And kicked him hard, and he didn't say anything. We were all terrified of her. When I walked the halls and tried to play cute, I was watching out to see if Mrs. Sleet was around the corner, because if she was, I was getting the hell out of there. As I said before, I was terrified of her. And my mother introduced us to, my mother was from Jamaica, and my father was a preacher in Jamaica. And my mother introduced me to her at a church called the Unity Church, which I'll talk about a little later. But Moneta Sleet is a very important guy. Little did I know when I met him that he was the person who was responsible for chronicling the civil rights movement. He was a famous photographer. He took pictures of all of these folks that you see here. The most famous of his pictures is the one where Martin Luther King's wife is in church at her husband's funeral with their daughter hanging off of her lap. Moneta Sleet took these pictures. I had no idea how important he was when I met him in church, but he and Mrs. Sleet turned out to be my guardian angels, because if it wasn't for him, I would have never gotten into college. Yeah, so my parents were from Jamaica, and they were Baptist in Jamaica, and my dad was a preacher. My dad, I guess he dabbled in being a preacher, and my mom would tell me stories about how they grew up in the church, and every day they went to church. They cooked in church every day. It was just like a church thing all day long. And the church pressured them to get married, and the church pressured them to live under the guise of Christian sanctity. And my mother talked about how sometimes it was overwhelming. So as a little boy, one day she took us out. She took us to Jamaica. I think I was 5 or 6 years old, and we were in this big field, this big courtyard, and it was like a religious revival. And they had a big projector, and they were playing what I thought was a horror movie. And the movie was about what hell looks like, right? And if you don't live by God's ordained whatever, that you're going to go to hell, right? And there was this preacher there with a microphone. He was like, the ways of sin is hell and death and then they played this movie of maggots eating people's faces in hell. And this went on for about 15 minutes in the dark, and there was sound effects, and it was a big booming system. It was almost like a party, but it was a horror movie party. Now, I'm terrified. I am terrified, and I'm sitting next to my mother as we're outside, and she's not saying a word. At one point, I forgot that she was there, and then they stopped the movie, thank God, and I stopped me from having a heart attack. And everybody stood up, and then the pastor said, now please come up and give your money to the church so that we can save you from hell. Well, I started immediately, I started looking in my pockets, and I started like trying to find change. I was like, Ma, come on, we got to get up there. We got to get up there and give these people our money so that we don't go to hell, right? And my mother stood up, and I remember looking up at her, and she said to me in this voice that I'd never heard her use before, and I saw her really vicious look in her face. She said, don't you move. And she didn't even look at me. She said, don't you move. And then she was staring at the pastor like she wanted to kill him. I'd never seen her look like that. I'd never seen her that angry before. And then I immediately realized, I was like, oh, I get it. She realized that they were full of shit. She realized what they were doing, and she didn't like it. She'd gone to America. She'd seen that it was a bunch of bullshit, and she brought me back to Jamaica to have a good time, and then they pulled this shit on her, and she was upset. She was as pissed off as I think Malcolm X was, learning that Jesus wasn't white. And she marched me out of there. She marched us out of there, and I used to go to church with this woman, my Aunt Faye and Uncle Horace. They were from that whole religious thing, and Aunt Faye and Uncle Horace had a church in Brooklyn, and Uncle Horace used to preach that hell, heaven business. And after that day in Jamaica, after that trip to Jamaica, I never went to church with Uncle Horace and Auntie Faye again. I never saw them again. And my mother, I guess she went on a hunt for a new religion, and she found something called the Unity Movement in a small church in Valley Stream, New York. Excuse me. And she took us there, me and my sister, and we would go there, and it was totally different. There was no guilt of like going to hell, and everything was about empathy and compassion, and that God loves us, and that we were all loving creatures, and it was a good thing to be on the earth, and we should, embrace our good and bad side and work through it to the good of humanity. It was just like a breath of fresh air. And to my surprise, Miss Sleet was at this church too. And she saw me, and she came over to me, and I was terrified of her. I was like, oh, Jesus, I knew this had to be too good to be true. And she walked over to me, and suddenly, for some reason, she wasn't angry. She was the sweetest woman in the world. She grabbed me and hugged me and pulled me to her bosom, and she called me baby, and she stroked my head like she was my long-lost aunt. And then she introduced me to Manetta Sleet, her husband, who had this big droopy eyes, and he was just as affectionate to me, and he was a man, and no black man had ever been affectionate to me. I thought that a black man being affectionate to me was gay, but he was affectionate to me, like more affectionate than my dad had never hugged me the way he did. But he hugged me. The both of them hugged me and embraced me and kissed me and told me I was the most beautiful thing in the world, and they became my new family. But what happened after that was that we moved from the South Shore to the North Shore. Well, we were in the North Shore, and there was another woman at Westbury High School named Mrs. Winter. And Mrs. Winter was dead set on me going to the Army. I was a troublemaker kid. I used to get into a lot of fights, and I used to argue, and I caused an all-out war between my new friends in Westbury and my old friends in Uniondale, where I had originally met Mrs. Sleet. It was literally a war, like they were going to kill me. My old friends from Uniondale were going to kill me. They surrounded my house like I was Al Pacino in Scarface, and were waiting for me to come outside. And it was a whole big thing. And we had wars at either Roosevelt Field or White Castle. There were wars. They were just brutal wars over this girl that was light-skinned, and it was a whole light-skinned, dark-skinned, and somehow my name got caught in it, and they felt like they were going to take out all their anger on me. And Miss Winter caught wind of this and said no, and refused to put my application to engineering school into Northeastern, and was saying to me, no, Bintell's going to the Army. And no matter how much my mother called her and cried, she refused to put my application into Northeastern. And I remember the final time where she refused was a Friday, and my mother was sitting at the dinner table, and I could tell she had that same look on her face, like the look she had when she looked at those religious people in Jamaica. And what she did, I didn't expect. I didn't expect her to do this, but she took us to church that Sunday, and she told Mrs. Sleet and Mr. Sleet what Mrs. Winter was doing. And she was crying in the courtyard. And Mrs. Sleet turned into the old Mrs. Sleet. She started stomping her feet. She started shaking her head, and she was like, "Who is she? Who is she? What's her name?" And even Mr. Sleet, who was the kindest, sweetest man, he looked like he was a Blood or a Crip from a gang. He turned into like a monster. I saw them. They surrounded my mother, and they were going to kill Mrs. Winter. And the next day, Monday, Miss Winter called me into her office out of class and gave me my application signed and told me that she sent it to Northeastern. Mrs. Sleet and Mr. Sleet threatened her life, is what the story goes. And that's how that's why I went to Northeastern. If I didn't go to Northeastern and Mrs. Sleet didn't take up for me and fight for me, this formula and what I'm doing would never be. And that's why I'm doing this. I'm doing this because Mrs. Sleet developed Parkinson's disease, and she used to go there and she would shake, and it used to just hurt me. It just hurt me to see her shaking like that. And Mrs. Sleet died. And the story goes that Manetta Sleet died of sadness soon thereafter. But Mr. Sleet, Manetta Sleet, was such an important person in black society and in our culture that when Bill Cosby did his final episode, ironically, where they were sending Theo off to college, and you see Bill Cosby in the stands when Theo graduates, if you look at the top of that scene, Manetta Sleet is in the bleachers with Bill Cosby. He was in that final episode. And the story goes that because Mrs. Sleet died and they were so in love with each other and they were such partners, that Manetta Sleet died of sadness. And I don't know where they are. I don't know where they're buried. I can't even go to their grave and put flowers down. I don't know where they are. But I owe them everything. I believe they're watching me. And that's why I'm doing this. That's why I'm raising hell. That's why I'm going to push this formula down the throats of American society and the school districts. Even if it means it kills me, I will give my life for this. Because if it was not for them, I'd have been dead long ago. I would have never gotten to Northeastern. I would have probably been shot in the face or in some operation, God knows where. Or if I didn't go to college, I would have gotten put in jail with some of my other friends that went to jail for selling drugs. God knows I was the worst of all of them. And if it wasn't for these people, none of this would be happening. And that is my why. That is part of my why. So I won't stop. And if you are out there and if I think you can help me and I know you and you have the resources to help me and you don't for no reason other than you just don't want to or you don't think it's important, I'm going to try to destroy you. Now, as a tribute to Mr. and Mrs. Sleet, I'm just going to leave you, ladies and gentlemen, with some of the images that Mr. Sleet has blessed us with, the timeless photos for you to just ponder on. And it is my hope that if you have the power to, that you contact me and you help me. Because our children, like I did when I was innocent and in high school, our children need us.